before we start. But we are on chapter 7. I went back one more to the last video and we had caught up. So we voices or no voices, the lady died sane. Talking about Ruth McCausland. So if you give me just a few minutes, we will start, but I need to take the pups out because my pup, who's 18 months, just got them eating. At least I hope she ate, because if she doesn't. Anyway, she ate, so I'm going to take her out, and I'm going to take her mama out. And so give me like 5 minutes, get yourselves something to drink, something to eat, you know, your book together, whatever. I'm going to go on BRB, and I will be right back. Don't go anywhere. I promise I'll be right back. All right, girls, do you need to go outside? That's Timber, you too. Alright, y'all, I'm back. I got me some tea and an apple. I was listening about giraffes. Finishing up my apple. Real quick. What? What? Yes, I can pet you while I'm reading. But I'm gonna read. We're gonna read about Beach Jurgensen and Dick Allison. That's what we're gonna read about. Cool? You wanna sit here and read? Alright. Chapter 7. This is part 2. We're still on. Chapter 7. Part 1. No one in Haven was more delighted about the becoming than Beach Jernigan. Excuse me, Jernigan, not Jurgensen. Jernigan. If guards Tommyknockers had appeared to Beach in person, carrying nuclear weapons and proposing that he plant one in each of the world's 7 largest cities, Beach would have immediately started phoning the plane tickets. Even in Haven, where quiet zealotry was becoming a way of life, Beach's partisanship was extreme. If he had had any idea at all about Gardner's growing doubts, he would have removed him permanently, and at once, if not sooner. And I almost forgot, in case somebody comes up, let's get this. Forgot to do. There we go. If anybody comes in, they know that we are reading. There we go. There was a good reason for Beach's feelings. In May, not long after Hilly Brown's birthday, in fact, Beach developed a hacking cough that wouldn't go away. It was worrisome because he didn't have a fever or sniffles to go with it. It became more worrisome when he began to cough up a little blood. When you run a restaurant, you don't want to be coughing at all. Customers don't like it. It makes them nervous. Sooner or later, someone tells the Board of Health, and maybe they shut you up for a week or so while they wait to see how your kind test comes out. The Haven lunch was a marginally profitable business at best. Beach was in 12 hours a day, short ordering, so he could clear $65 a week. If the place hadn't been his free and clear, he would have starved. And Beach couldn't afford to be shut down for a week in the summer. Summer wasn't here yet, but it was coming up apace. So he went to see Doc Warwick, and Doc Warwick sent him up to Derry Home for a chest x-ray. When the x-ray came back, Doc Warwick studied it for all of 20 seconds, and then called Beach, and when Beach got there, Doc Warwick said, "I've got hard news for you, Beach. Sit down." Beach sat down. He felt that if there hadn't been a chair, he would have fallen on the floor. All the strength had run out of his legs. There was no telepathy going on in Haven back in May. No more than the ordinary kind that people use all the time anyway. And that ordinary kind was all Beach needed. He knew what Doc Warwick was going to say before he said it. Not TB. Big C lung cancer. But that was in May. Now, in July, Beach was fit as a fiddle. Doc Warwick had told him he could expect to be in the hospital by July 15th. But here he was, eating like a horse, randy as a bear most of the time, and feeling like he could outrun Bobby Tremaine, in a foot race. He hadn't been back in the hospital for another chest x-ray. He didn't need one to know the large, dark stain on his left lung had disappeared. As far as that went, if he had wanted an x-ray, he could have taken the afternoon off, built an x-ray machine himself. He knew just how it could be done. But now, in the wake of the explosion, there were other... Excuse you. No, we are not barking at people. Back up. Nope. Back up. We're not barking at people going by. Thank you. But now, in the wake of the explosion, there were other things to be built, other things to do, and quickly. They had a meeting, everyone in town. Not that they gathered, as at a town meeting. That was quite unnecessary. Beach went on frying hamburgers in a Haven lunch. Nancy Voss went on sorting stamps at the post office. Now that Joe was dead, it was at least a place to come to, Sunday or not. Bobby Tremaine stayed under his Challenger, putting on a backflow rebreather that would allow him to get roughly 70 miles to the gallon. Not Anderson's gas pill, not quite, but close. Newt Beringer, who knew goddamn well there was no time to waste, was driving out to the Applegate place as fast as he dared. But no matter what they were doing or where they were together. A network of silent voices. The voices that had frightened Ruth so badly. I just started, what's up? What's up? Phoebe, please stop. What's up? What do you need me to do? Give me a minute, guys. I'll be right back. I'm back. Help puppy real quick. Hi. I'm doing better. A lot better, actually. A heck of a lot better. Yeah. This past week has been rough. So, all I can hope is that nobody else gets sick because so far they haven't. Less than 45 minutes after the explosion, some 70 people had gathered at Henry Applegate's. Henry had the largest, best-equipped workshop in town, now that the Shell station had mostly gone out of the engine repair and tune-up business. Christina Lindy, who was only 17, but had still taken second place in the 14th annual State of Maine photography competition a year before, arrived back almost 2 hours later, scared, out of breath, feeling rather sexy if the truth was to be told. From riding in from town with Bobbi Tremaine at speeds which sometimes topped 110. When Bobbi made the Dodge walk and talk, it was nothing but a yellow streak. She had been dispatched to take 2 photographs of the clock tower. This was delicate work because, with the tower now reduced to scattered chunks of brick, masonry, and clockwork, it meant taking a photograph of a photograph. Working fast, Christina had thumbed through a scrapbook of town photographs. Newt had told her mentally where to find this, in Ruth McCausland's own office. She rejected 2 shots because, although both were quite good, both were also in black and white. The intention was build an illusion, a clock tower that people could look at, but one you could fly a plane through, even if it came to that. In other words, they intended to project a gigantic magic lantern slide in the sky. A good trick. Once upon a time, Hilly Brown would have envied it. Just as Christina was beginning to lose hope, she found it. A gorgeous photo of a Haven Village town hall, with the town prominently displayed, a tower prominently displayed, and from an angle that clearly showed both sides. Great. That would give them the depth of field they would need. Ruth's careful notation beneath the photograph said it came from Yankee Magazine, 587, or May of 87. We gotta go, Chris, Bobby had said, speaking to her without bothering to use his mouth. He was shifting impatiently from foot to foot like a small boy in need of a bathroom. You all right? This will... She broke off. Oh, she said. Oh, dear. Bobby Tremaine came forward quickly. What the hell's wrong? She pointed at the photograph. Ah, shit, Bobby Tremaine yelled out loud, and Christina nodded. 2. By 7 that evening, working fast and silently, except for the occasional ill-tempered snarl of someone who felt someone else was not working fast enough, they had constructed a device that looked like a huge slide projector on top of an industrial vacuum cleaner. They tested it. A woman's face, huge and stony, appeared in Henry's field. The people who had gathered stared at the stereopticon of Henry Applegate's grandmother silently but approvingly. The machine worked. Now, as soon as the girl brought the photographs actually, because a stereopticon image was of course exactly what they had to create, of the town hall they could. Then her voice, faint, but boosted by Bobby Tremaine's mind, came to them. It was bad news. What was it? Kyle Archambault asked Newt. I didn't catch all of it. Are you fucking deaf? Andy Baker snarled. Jesus Christ, people in 3 counties heard the bang when the bitch blew the roof off. For 2 cents. He balled his fists. Quit it, both of you, Hazel McCready said. She turned to Kyle. That girl has done a hell of a job. She was deliberately projecting as hard as she could, hoping to reach Christina Lindy, as well as explain the situation to Kyle Archambault. To buck her up, the girl had thought. Sounded distraught, nearly hysterical, and she wouldn't do them any good that way. In such a state, she could fuck up for sure, or she would fuck up for sure, and they just didn't have time for fuck-ups. It's not her fault. You can read the clock in the photo. What do you mean? Kyle asked. She found a color photo of an angle that couldn't be more perfect, Hazel said. It looked exactly right from the church and the cemetery, and only a little distorted from the road. We'll have to keep outsiders from going around to the back for a couple days until Chris finds a rough matching angle. But since they're going to be interested in the furnace and in Ruth, I think we can get away with that. Close some roads? She looked at Newt. Sewer work, he said promptly. Easy as pie. I still don't understand the nature of the problem, Kyle said. Might be you, fucking idiot, Andy Baker said. Kyle swung truculently toward the mechanic, and Newt said, Stop, both of you. And to Kyle, the problem is that Ruth blew the tower off the town hall at 3:05 this afternoon. In the only good picture Christina found, you can read the clock face. It says 9:45. Oh, Kyle said, but suddenly turned, his face oily. He took out his handkerchief and mopped it. Ah, shit. What do we do now? Ad lib, Hazel said calmly. Bitch, Andy cried. I'd kill her if she wasn't already dead. Everyone in town loved her, and you know it, Andy, Hazel said. Yeah, and I hope the devil's toasting her with a large fork down in hell. Andy switched the gadget off. Henry's grandmother disappeared. Hazel was relieved. There was something a little ghastly about seeing that hatchet-faced woman floating in perfect 3D above Henry's field with the cows, which should have been stabled long ago. Sometimes wandering through her as they grazed, or disappearing casually through the large old-fashioned brooch the woman wore on her high-necked collar. It's going to be fine, Bobbi Anderson said, suddenly in the quiet, and everyone, including Christina Lindy, back in town, heard and was relieved. "Free. Take me to my house," she said to Bobbi Tremaine. "Quick, I know what to do." "You're there." He took her arm and began pulling her toward the door. "Hold it," she said. "Huh? Don't you think I better bring the photograph?" she finished. "Aw, shit," Bobby said, and slapped his forehead. 4. Dick Allison, meanwhile, who was chief of Haven's volunteer fire department, was sitting in his office sweating bullets in spite of the air conditioning, fielding telephone calls. The first was from the Troy constable, the second from the Unity chief of police, the third from the state police, the fourth from AP. He probably would have been sweating anyway, but one of the reasons the air conditioning wasn't doing him any good was his door had been blown off its hinges by the force of the blast. Most of the plaster had fallen off the walls, revealing lathing-like decayed ribs. He sat in the middle of the wreckage and told his callers that it sure had been a hell of a bang, and it looked as if they probably had one fatality, but it was nowhere near as bad as it could have been, as it had probably sounded. While he was rolling out this bullshit for a guy from the Bangor Daily News named John Leandro, a cork ceiling panel fan fell on his head. Dick slashed it aside with a wolfish snarl, laughed, and it was just the bulletin board. Goddamn thing had fallen over again. It just had those sucker things on the back, Well, if you bought cheap, you got cheap, Mother has always told him, and it took another 5 minutes, and he finally bored Leandro off the phone. And as he put his own telephone back on the cradle, most of the hallway ceiling outside his door fell with a powdery crump. "Motherfucking cocksucking son of a fucking bitch," Dick Allison screamed, and brought his left fist down on the desk as hard as he could. Although he broke all 4 fingers, he didn't even notice in his raving fury. If, at that moment, anyone had come into his office, Allison would have ripped that person's throat open, filled his mouth with hot blood, and then sprayed it back into the dying person's face. He screamed and swore and even drummed his feet up and down on the floor like a child doing a tantrum because he had been denied an outing. He looked childish. He also looked extremely dangerous. Tommyknockers, knocking at the door. 5. In between phone calls, Dick went into Hazel's office, found the Midol in her drawer, and took 6. Then he wrapped his throbbing, swelling hand tightly and forgot it. If he had still been human, this would have been impossible. One does not simply forget 4 broken fingers. But since they had become, one of the things that included was becoming able to exercise conscious will over pain. It came in handy. In between his conversations with the outside, and sometimes during them, Dick spoke to the men and women working furiously at Henry Applegate's. He told them he expected a couple of state cops by 4:30, 5 o'clock at the latest. Could they have the slide protector ready by then? When Hazel explained the problem, Dick began to rave again, this time with fear as well as anger. When Hazel explained what Christina Lindy was up to, he calmed a little. She had a home darkroom. There, she would carefully make a negative of the Yankee picture and enlarge it slightly, not because it needed to be bigger for the slide projector device to work, and too much enlarging would give their clock tower illusion an odd, grainy look, but because she needed a slightly bigger image to work with. She was going to turn a negative, Hazel said in his mind, then airbrush out the hands on the clock face. Bobbi Tremaine was going to put them back in with the X-Acto knife. So they say, 3:05. He's got a steady hand and a little talent. Right now, a steady hand seems more important. I thought if you made a negative from a positive, it came out blurry, Dick Allison said. Especially if the positive's color. She improved her development equipment, Hazel said. She didn't need to add in that 17-year-old Christina Lindy now had what was probably the most advanced darkroom on Earth. So how long? Midnight, she thinks, Hazel said. Raced on a pony, Dick shouted, loud enough to make the people in Henry's field wince. We'll need about 30 D cells, Bobbi Anderson's voice cutting calmly. Be a love. See to that, Dick. And we understand about the police. Play hee-haw for them. You understand? He paused. Yes, he said. Buck and Roy, junior samples. Exactly. And hold them. It's their radio I'm really worried about, not them. They'll only send one unit, two at most, to start with. But if they radio it in. There was a murmur of assent, like the sound of the ocean in a conch shell. Is there a way you can damp out their transmissions from town? Bobbi asked. Andy Baker suddenly cut in gleefully. I got a better idea. But Peters to shuck his fat ass over to the gas station right now. Yes, Bobbi overrode him, her thought shrill with excitement. Good, great. And when they leave town, someone, Beach, I think. Beach was honored to be chosen. 6. Bent Rhodes and Jingles Gabbins of the Maine State Police arrived in Haven at 5:15. They came expecting to find the smoky, uninteresting aftermath of a furnace explosion. One old pump truck idling at the curb, 20 or 30 onlookers idling on the sidewalk. Instead, they found the entire Haven Town Hall clock tower blown off like a Roman candle. Bricks littered the street, windows were blown out. There were dismembered dolls everywhere, too damn many people going about their business. Dick Allison greeted them with a weird cordiality, as if this was a Republican bean dinner instead of what now looked like a disaster of real magnitude. Christ almighty, man, what happened here? Ben asked him. Well, I guess maybe it was a little worse than I made out over the phone, Dick said, surveying the brick-littered street and then giving the two troopers the incongruous "ain't I a bad boy" smile. Guess I didn't think anyone would believe it unless they saw it, Jingles muttered. I'm seeing it, and I don't believe it. They had both dismissed Dick Allison as a small-town bumbler, probably crazy in the bargain. That was all right. He stood behind them, watching them stare at the wreckage. The smile faded gradually from his face, and his expression became cold. Rhodes spotted the human arm amid all of the tiny make-believe limbs. When he turned back to Dick, his face was whiter than it had been, and he looked considerably younger. Where is Mrs. McCausland? He asked. His voice rose uncontrollably and broke on the last syllable. Well, I think that might be part of our problem, Dick began. You see. 7. Dick did hold them in town as long as he could, without being conspicuous about it. It was 7:45 before they left, and by then twilight was drawing down. And also Dick knew, if they didn't leave soon, they would start wondering how come none of the backup units they had requested were arriving. They had both talked on their cruiser's radio to Derry Base, and both hung up the mic again, looking puzzled and distracted. The responses they were getting from the other end were right. It was the voice that seemed a little off. But neither of them could be bothered with such a minor matter, at least not for the time being. There were too many other things to cope with. The magnitude of the accident, for one thing. The fact that they had known the victim for another. Trying to lay the groundwork of a potentially big case without committing any of the procedural fuck-ups that would muddy the waters later on, for a third. Also, they were beginning to feel the effects of being in Haven. They were like men applying vinyl seal to a big wooden floor in a room with no ventilation, getting stoned without even knowing it. They weren't healing thoughts. It was too early for that, and they would be gone before it could happen. But they were feeling very strange. It was slowing them down, making ordinary routine something they had to fight their way through. Dick Allison got all this from their minds as he sat across the street drinking a cup of coffee in the Haven lunch. They were too busy and too screwed up to think about the fact that Tug Ellender, their dispatch, didn't exactly sound like himself tonight. The reason why was very simple. They weren't talking to Tug Ellender. They were talking to Buck Peters. Their radio transmissions were not going to and from Derry, but to and from the garage of Elk Barker's shell, where Buck Peters was hunched, sweating over a microphone, and Andy Baker beside him. Buck sent out fresh instructions and information on Andy's radio. A little something he had scrambled together in his spare time. A little something that could have contacted life on Uranus, had there been any good buddies up there to send back a Big 10-4. Several townspeople were concentrating hard on the minds of Buck Bent Rhodes and Jingles Gabbins. They relayed to Buck everything they were able to pick up about Ellender, from whom the cops just naturally expected to hear. Buck Peters had some natural mimicry. He was a great hit doing whoever happened to be president that year, plus such favorites as Jimmy Cagney, John Wayne, at each year's Grange stage spectacular. He was not Rich Little, never would be, but when he did somebody, you knew who it was, usually. More important, the listeners were able to relay to Buck how he should respond to each transmission, since almost every speaker knows in his own mind what response he expects to get from the questions or statements. If Bent and Jingles bought the impersonation, to a large extent they really did, it wasn't so much due to Buck's talents as to their own fulfilled expectations in Tug's replies. Andy had further been able to blur Buck's voice by overlaying some static. Not so much as they could hear on their way back to Derry, but enough so that Tug's voice grew a little blurred whenever that oddness. Jesus, that doesn't sound like Tug much at all. I wonder, does he have a cold? Surfaced in one of their minds. At 7:15, when Beach brought him a fresh cup of coffee, Dick asked, "You all set?" "Sure am." "And you're sure the gadget will work?" "It works fine. Want to see it?" Beach was almost fawning. "No, there isn't time." "What about the deer? You got that?" "I Bill Elderly killed it, and Dave Rutledge dressed it out." "That's good. Get going." "Okay, Dick." Beach took off his apron and hung it on the nail behind the counter. He turned over the sign which hung above the door, from open to closed. Ordinarily, it would just have hung there. But tonight, because the glass was broken, it stirred and twisted in the mild breeze. Beach paused and looked back at Dick with narrow, sunken anger. "She wasn't supposed to do nothing like that," he said. Dick shrugged. "It doesn't matter. It was done. She's gone. That's the important thing. The kids are doing fine with that picture. As far as Ruth, there's no one else like her in town. There's that fellow out at the old Garrick's place. He's drunk all the time, and he wants to dig it up. Go on, Beach. They'll be leaving soon, and we want it to happen as far out of the village as you can make it happen." "Okay, Dick. Be careful." Dick smiled. "We all gotta be careful now. This is touchy." He watched Beach get into his truck and back out of the space in front of the Haven lunch that had been that old Chevy's home for the last 12 years. As the truck started up the street, Beach driving slowly and weaving to avoid the litters of broken glass, Dick could see the shape under the tarp and the truck's bed, and near the back, something else, wrapped in a sheet of heavy plastic. The biggest deer Bill Elderly had been able to find on such short notice. Deer hunting was most definitely against the law during July in the state of Maine. When Beach's pickup was out of sight, "Make love, not war. Be ready for both. NRA." The bumper sticker on the tailgate read. Dick turned back to the counter and picked up his coffee cup. As always, Beach's coffee was strong and good. He needed that. Dick was more than tired. He was worn out. Although there was still good light left in the sky, and although he had always been the sort of person who found it impossible to sleep until the national anthem had played on the last available TV channel, all he wanted now was his own bed. This had been a tense, frightening day, and it wouldn't be over until Beach reported in. Nor would the mess Ruth McCausland had succeeded in making be cleaned up when the two cops were erased. They would hide a lot of things, but not the simple fact that those cops had been on their way back from Haven, where another cop, just a town constable, true, but a cop was a cop, and this one had been married to a state bear, just to add to the fun, had been erased from the equation, all of which meant that the fun was just beginning. You call it fun, Dick said sourly, to no one in particular. Big dog fuck if I do. The coffee began to burn with acid indigestion in Dick's stomach. He went on drinking it anyway. Outside, a power motor roared. Dick swiveled around on his stool and watched the cops drive out of town. The flashers on top of their cruiser swinging blue light and black shadow on the wreckage. 8. Christina Lindy and Bobby Tremaine stood side by side, watching the blank sheet of the developing bath, neither of them breathing as they waited for the image to come or not come. Little by little, it did. There was the Haven Town Hall clock tower in living true color, and the hands of the clock stood at 3:05. Bobby let out his breath in a low, slow exultation. Perfect, he said. Not quite, Christina said. There's one more thing. He turned to her apprehensive. What? What's wrong? Nothing. Everything's right. It's just that there's one more thing we have to do. She was not ugly, but because she wore glasses and her hair was mousy brown, she had always considered herself ugly. She was 17 and had never been on a date. Now, none of that seemed to matter. She unzipped her skirt and pushed it, her rayon half slip, and her cotton panties, both bought at the discount store in Derry, down. She stepped out of them and carefully took the wet photograph from the developing bath. She stood on tiptoe to hang it up. Smooth buttocks flexed, and then she turned to him, legs spread. I need doing. He took her standing up against the wall. When her hymen burst, she bit his shoulder hard enough to bring blood from him as well. And when they came together, they did it snarling and clawing. It was very, very good. Just like old times, Bobby thought as he drove them out to the Applegate place, and wondered exactly what he meant by that. Then he decided it really didn't matter anyway. 9. Beach got his Chevy pickup to a creaky 65, as fast as it would go. One of the few things he hadn't gotten around to overhauling was his fantastic new knowledge, was the old bomber. But he hoped it would get him as far as he needed to go tonight, and old Betsy came through for him again. When he had gotten over the Troy town line, without hearing them or seeing any sign of their flashers behind him, he eased the truck back to 55, with some relief. It had been on the edge of overheating. And when he got into Newport, he dropped back to 45. Dark was coming on hard by then. He was over the Derry town line, and just starting to worry about the freaking cops. Worry that the freaking cops had gone back some other way. It seemed unlikely, since this was the quickest way. But Jesus, where were they? When they heard the low mutter of their thoughts, he pulled over quietly and sat quietly for a moment, head cocked, eyes half closed, listening, making sure. His mouth, oddly infirm and puckered with the most of his teeth gone, was the mouth of a much older man. It was something about Freckles. Ruth. It was them, all right. Thought came clearer. You could see the freckles right through the blood, and Beach nodded. It was them, all right. They were coming along fast. He'd have time, but only if he hustled. Beach drove another quarter of a mile up the road, rounded a curve, and saw the last long stretch of Route 3 between here and Derry. He turned his pickup sideways, blocking the road. Then he removed the tarp from the rifle thing in back. Fingers plucked nervously at high rope knots as their voices grew stronger in his head. When their lights splashed the trees on this side of the curb, Beach got his head down. He reached for the train transformers, 6 of them, that had been nailed to a board, and the board had been bolted to the truck bed so it wouldn't slide around. He turned them on, one after another. He heard the hum as they powered up, then that sound, every sound, lost in the shriek of brakes and tires. Now light that was flashbulb white, shot through the strobing blue flashes, filled the bed of the pickup truck, and Beach pressed himself against the bottom, hands laced over his head, thinking he had blown it, parked too close to the blind turn, and as they were going to crash into his truck, and they might only be injured if he would be killed, and they would find the ruins of his rifle, say, well now, what's this? And, you fucked up, Beach. They saved your life and you fucked up. Oh, damn you, damn you, damn you. Then the shrieking tire stopped. The smell of cooked rubber was strong and sickening. But the crash for which he had been braced hadn't come. Blue light strode, a microphone cracked static. Dimly he heard the hoarse voice cop say, what's this shit? Shakily Beach did a girly push-up, peered over the edge of the truck bed with just his eyes. He saw their cruiser halted at the end of the long pair of black skid marks. Even by starlight, those marks were clearly visible. The cruiser was sitting at the cockeyed angle, not 9 feet away. If they had been going just 5 miles an hour faster. Yeah, but they weren't. Sounds. The double clunk of the doors closing as they got out of their car. Faint, dull hum of the transformers which powered this gadget. A gadget that was not all that different from the ones Ruth had planted in the bellies of her dolls. And a low buzzing sound. Flies. They smelled the blood under the plastic sheet, but couldn't get at the deer's carcass. You'll get your chance soon enough, Beach thought, and grinned. Too bad you won't get a taste of those old boys out there. I saw that truck back in Haven, Ben, a hoarse voiced one said. Parked in front of the restaurant. Beach swiveled the culvert pipe slightly in its cradle. Looking through it, he could see them both. And if one of them moved out of the actual power axis of the gadget, that was okay. There was a slight flare effect. Get away from the car, boys, Beach thought, picking up the doorbell from the Western Auto and settling a thumb on it. His grin showed pink gums. Don't want to get none of the car. Away, all right. Who's there? The cop shouted. Tommyknockers here, knocking at your door. You meddling shithead, he thought, and began to giggle. He couldn't help it. He tried to stifle it as best he could. If someone's in that truck, you better speak up. He began to giggle louder. Just couldn't help it. And maybe that was just as well, because they took a look at each other and then began to move toward the truck, unholstering their guns, toward the truck and away from their cruiser. Each waited until he was sure the cruiser wouldn't be touched by the flare. They had told him not to harm the police car, and he intended not to take so much as a layer of chrome off the bumper. When the cops were clear, each pushed the doorknob. Avon calling, shitheads, he thought. And this time, he didn't just giggle, he whooped. A thick branch of green fire shot out in the dark, catching both of the policemen and enveloping them. Beach saw several bright yellow sparks inside the green glare, and understood that one of the cops was triggering his pistol off again and again. Beach could smell the thick aroma of cooking transformers. There was a sudden pop, and a twisting skyrocket of sparks from one of them. Some of the sparks landed on his arm, stinging, but he brushed them off. The green fire coming from the end of the culvert winked out. The policemen were gone. Well, almost gone. Beach jumped over the tailgate of the truck, moving just as fast as he could. It wasn't the turnpike, God knew. No one from the country headed into Derry to go shopping this late. No one from the country headed into Derry to go shopping this late, but someone would be along sooner or later. He should. Sitting on the pavement was a single smoking shoe. He picked it up, almost dropped it. He hadn't expected it to be so heavy. Looking inside, he saw why. The sock-encased foot was still inside it. Beach carried it back to his truck and tossed it into the cab. When he got back to town, he would get rid of it. No need to bury it. There were more efficient ways of getting rid of things in Haven. If the Mafia knew what us Yankee hicks got up to, I guess they'd want to buy them a franchise, Beach thought, and tittered again. He pulled the pins on the tailgate. It fell flat open with a rusty crash. He grabbed the plastic-wrapped carcass of the deer. Whose idea had this been, he wondered? Old Dave's? Didn't really matter. In Haven, all ideas were now becoming one. The plastic-wrapped bundle was heavy and awkward. Each got his arms around the buck's rear legs and pulled. It came out of the truck, its head thudding onto the tarvy. Beach looked around again for brightening headlights on either horizon, saw none, and dragged the deer across the road as fast as he could. He put it down with a grunt and flipped the carcass over so they could free the plastic. Now he got the deer, which had been neatly gutted and cleaned, in both arms and picked it up. Cords stood out on his neck like cables. His skinned back lips would have shown his teeth, had any been left in his gums. The deer's head, with its half-grown antlers, hung down below his right forearm. Its dusty eyes stared off into the night. Beach staggered 3 steps down the sloping soft shoulder, threw the deer's body into the ditch, where it landed with a thud. He stepped away and picked up the plastic. He carried it back to the truck and bundled it into the passenger side of the cab. He would have liked it better in back. It stank. There was always a chance it would blow out and be found. He hurried around to the driver's side of the truck, plucked his blood-damped shirt away from his chest, with a little grimace as he did. He changed as soon as he got home. He got in, started Betsy's motor. He backed and filled until he was pointed back toward Haven, and then paused for just a moment, surveying the scene, trying to see if the story it told was the one it was supposed to tell. He thought it did. Here was a bare mobile sitting dead empty in the middle of the road at the end of the long skid. Engine off, flashers going. There was a gutted carcass of the good-sized buck in the ditch. That wouldn't go unnoticed long. Not in July. Was there anything in the story that whispered Haven? Beach didn't think so. The story was about 2 cops returning to Baird's after investigating a single fatality accident. They just happened to run on a gang of men jacklighting deer. What happened to the cops? That was the question, wasn't it? The possible answers would look more and more ominous as the days passed. They were jacklighters in the story. Jacklighters who'd perhaps panicked, shot a couple of cops, and then buried them in the woods. Haven? Beach really didn't believe they would think that it was completely a different story. One nowhere near as interesting. Now, in his rearview mirror, he could see approaching headlights. He put his truck in low, skirted the police cruiser. Its flashers bathed him in a half a dozen blue pulse beats, and then it was behind him. Beach glanced to his right, saw the regular issue black shoe with its runner of regulation blue sock poking out like a tail of a kite, and cackled. Bet when you put that shoe on this morning, Mr. Smartass State Bear, you didn't have no idea where he would finish up tonight. Beach stared again, cackled again, and fetched some gear with a ram and a jerk. Fetched second gear with a ram and a jerk. He was headed home, and he had never felt goodly damn better in his whole life. Yes. Not coughing as bad. We're going to continue to 8. Bev Hillman, 1. Lead story, Banger, Daily News, July 25th, 1988. 2 state police disappear in Derry. Area-wide manhunt begins. By David Bright. The discovery of an abandoned state police cruiser in Derry last night, shortly after 9:30, was touched off the second major search of the summer in eastern and central Maine. The first was 4-year-old David Brown of Haven, who is still missing. Ironically, the officers, Benton Rhodes and Peter Gabbins, were returning from the same town in the time of their disappearance, having just completed their preliminary investigation of a furnace fire which took 1 life. He related the story this page. In the late development, which one police insider described as the worst possible news he could have at this time. The body of a deer, which had been shot, gutted, and cleaned, was found near the cruiser, leading to speculations that, too. There! Look at that, Beach said to Dick Allison and Newt Barringer over coffee the next morning. They were in the Haven lunch, looking at the paper, which had just come in. We all thought nobody would make the connection. Damn! Relax, Newt said. Dick nodded. No one is going to connect the disappearance of the 4-year-old boy who probably just wandered off into the woods or got picked up and driven away by a sex pervert with the disappearance of 2 big, strong state bears. Right, Dick? As rain. 3. Wrong. 4. Page 1, Bangor Daily News, below the fold. Haven constable killed in freak accident was community leader by John Leandro. Ruth McCausland, one of only 3 women constables in Maine, died yesterday in her hometown of Haven. She was 50. Richard Allison, head of Haven's volunteer fire department, says that Mrs. McCausland appeared to have been killed when oil fumes, which had collected in the town hall basement as a result of a faulty valve, ignited. Allison said that the lighting in the basement, where a lot of town records were stored, was not very good. She may have struck a match, Allison said. At least, that is the theory we are going on now. And if any evidence of arson had been found, Allison said there had not, but admitted that the disappearance of the 2 state troopers sent to investigate the mishap, see story above, made that more difficult to determine, since neither of the investigating officers have been able to file a report. I imagine we'll have the state fire inspectors up here. Right now, I'm more concerned about investigating officers turned up safe and sound. Newt Barringer, Haven's head selectman, said that the entire town was in a deep mourning for Mrs. McCausland. She was a great woman, Barringer said, and we all loved her. Other Haven townsmen echoed the sentiment. Not a few of them in tears as they spoke to Mrs. McCausland. Her public service in the small town of Haven began in 5. It was, of course, Hilly's grandfather, Ev, who made the connection. Ev Hillman, who could have rightly been called the town in exile. Ev Hillman, who had come back from Big 2 with 2 small steel plates in his head as a result of German potato masher, which had exploded near him during the Battle of the Bulge. He spent the Monday morning after Haven's explosion Sunday, where he had been spending all of his mornings, in room 371 of the Dairy Home Hospital, watching over Hilly. He had taken a furnished room down on Lower Main Street and spent his largely sleepless nights. Thereafter the nurses finally turned him out. Sometimes he would lie in the dark and think he heard chuckling noises coming from the drains, and he would think, "You're going nuts, old-timer," except he wasn't. Sometimes he wished he were. He had tried to talk to some of the nurses about what he believed had happened to David, what he knew had happened to David. They pitied him. He did not see their pity at first. His eyes were only opened after he had made the mistake of talking to the reporter. They had opened his eyes. He thought the nurses admired him for his loyalty to Hilly, but felt sorry for him because Hilly seemed to be slipping away. And they also thought him mad. Little boys did not disappear during tricks performed in your backyard magic shows. You didn't even have to go to the nursing school to know that. After a while in Derry alone, half out of his mind with worry for Hilly and David and contempt for what he saw as cowardice on his part, and fear for Ruth McCausland and the others in Haven, Ev had done some drinking at a little bar halfway down Lower Main. In the course of the conversation with the bartender, he heard the story of a fellow named John Smith, who had taught in the nearby town of Cleves Mills for a while. Smith had been in a coma for years, had awakened with some sort of psychic gift. He went nuts a few years ago, had tried to assassinate a fellow named Stilson, who was a U.S. representative from New Hampshire. The dead zone. For that. Don't know if there was ever any truth to that psychic part of it or not, the bartender said, drawing Eve a fresh beer. Believe most of the stuff is just eyewash myself. But if you've got some wild-ass tale to tell, Eve had hinted he had a story to tell that would make the Amityville Horror tame. Then Bright at the Bangor Daily News, the guy you ought to tell it to. He wrote up the Smith guy for the paper. He drops in here for a beer every once in a while. Tell you, mister, he believed Smith had the sight. Evan had 3 beers rapidly, one after another, just enough, in other words, to believe that simple solutions might be possible. He went to the payphone, laid out his change on the shelf, called the Bangor Daily News. David Bright was in, and Ev spoke to him. He didn't tell him the story, not over the phone, but said that he had a tale to tell, and he didn't understand what it all meant, but he thought people ought to know about it and fast. How to know about it fast. Bright sounded interested. More, he sounded sympathetic. He asked Ev if when he would come up to Bangor. That Bright did not speak of coming to Derry to interview the old man should have tipped Ev to the idea that he might have overestimated both Brighton's belief and his sympathy, and Ev had asked if that very night would be okay. Well, I'll be here another 2 hours, Bright said. Can you be here before midnight, Mr. Hillman? Bet your buns, the old man snapped and hung up. When he walked out of the Wally's Spa on Lower Main, there was fire in his eye and a spring in his step. He looked 20 years younger than a man who had shuffled in. But it was 25 miles up to Bangor, and the 3 beers wore off. By the time Ev got to the news building, he was sober again. Worse, head was fuzzy and confused. He was aware of telling the story badly, of circling around again and again to the magic show, to the way Hilly had looked, to his certainty that David Brown had really disappeared. At last he stopped. Only it was not so much a stopping as a drying up of the increasingly sluggish flow. Bright was tapping a pencil against the side of the desk, not looking at Ev. You never actually look under the platform at the time, Mr. Hillman? No, but... Are you going to him now? I will talk to him. Now Bright did look at him, and he had a kind face. But in it Ev saw the expression which had opened his eyes. The man thought he was just as mad as a March hare. Mr. Hillman, all of this is very interesting. Who's bonus for the thing over there on the counter? Talking about the ribs? Yeah. I'm making them for dinner. Never mind, Ev said, giving up. The chair he had been sitting in bumped back so rapidly it almost fell over. He was dimly aware of the word processor terminals tapping, phones ringing, people walking back and forth in the city room with papers in their hands. Mostly he was aware that it was midnight. He was tired and sick with fear. And this fellow thought he was crazy. Never mind, it's late. You'll be wanting to go home to your family, I guess. Mr. Hillman, if you'd just see it from my perspective, you'd understand that I do see it from your side, I've said. For the first time, I guess I have to go too, Mr. Bright. I got a long drive ahead of me. Visiting hours start at 9. Sorry to have wasted your time. He got out of there fast, curiously reminding himself that he would have remembered what he should have remembered in the first place. That there was no fool, like an old fool, and he guessed tonight's work showed him off as just about the biggest old fool as well. Of all. Well, so much for trying to tell people what was happening in Haven. He was old, but he was damned if he ever put up with another look like that, ever in his life. 6. The resolution lasted only 56 hours, until he got the look at the headlines on Monday's papers. Looking at them, he found himself wanting to go and see the man in charge of investigating the disappearance of 2 state cops. The news said his name was Dugan, and mentioned that he had also known Ruth McCausland well. Would, in fact, take time off from extremely hot case to speak briefly at the lady's funeral. Must have known her pretty damned well, it seemed to Ev. But when he searched for any of the previous night's fire and excitement, he only found sour dread and hopelessness. The 2 stories on the front page had taken most of the guts he had left. Haven's turning into the nest of snakes, and now they're starting to bite. I have to convince someone of that, and how am I going to do it? How am I going to convince anyone that there's telepathy going on in that town? And Christ knows what else. How, when I can barely remember how I knew things were going on? How, when I never really saw nothing myself? How? Most of all, how am I supposed to do it when the whole goddamn thing is staring them in the face, and they don't even see it? There's a whole town going loony just down the road, and no one's got the slightest idea it's happening. He turned the obituary page again. Ruth's clear eyes looked up at him from one of those strange newsprint pictures. There were nothing but densely packed dots. Her eyes, so clear and straightforward and beautiful, looked calmly back at him. Ev guessed that there had been at least 5 or maybe as many as a dozen men in Haven who had been in love with her, and she had never even known it. Her eyes seemed to deny the very idea of death, to declare it ridiculous, but dead she was. He remembered taking Hilly out while the search party gathered. You could come with us, Ruthie. Ev, I can't. Get in touch with me. He had tried just once, thinking that if Ruth joined him in Derry, she would be out of danger. She could backstep his story. In this state of confusion and misery, and yes, even homesickness, Ev wasn't even sure which was more important to him. In the end, it didn't matter. He had tried 3 times to dial Haven Direct, the last one after speaking to Bright, and none of the calls took. He tried once with operator assistance, and she told him that there must be lines down. Would he try again? Would he try later? Ev said he would, but hadn't. He had lain down in the dark instead, and listened to the drains chuckle. Now, less than 3 days later, Ruth had gotten in touch with him via the obituary page. No idea what she's doing. He looked up at Hilly. Hilly was sleeping. The doctors refused to call it a coma. His brain patterns were not the brain patterns of a comatose patient, they said. They were the brain patterns of a person in deep sleep. Ev didn't care what they called it. He knew Hilly was slipping away, and whether it was into a state called autism, even Ev didn't know what the word meant, but he had heard one of the doctors mutter it to another in a low voice he hadn't been meant to overhear. Or one called coma didn't make any difference at all. They were just words. Slipping away was what it came down to. That was quite terrible enough. On the ride to Derry, the boy had acted like the person in deep shock. Ev had had a vague idea that getting him out of Haven would improve matters, and in their frantic concern over David, neither Brent nor Marie seemed to notice how odd their older boy seemed. I don't know if we'll make it through this chapter, but we're going to get as far as we can in the next half hour. Getting out of Derry hadn't helped. Hilly's awareness and coherence had continued to decline. The first day in the hospital, he had slept 11 hours out of 24. He could answer simple questions. More complicated ones confused him. He complained of a headache. He didn't remember the magic show at all, and seemed to think his birthday had been only a week before. That night, sleeping deeply, he had spoken one phrase quite clearly. All the G.I. Joes. Ev's back had crawled. It was what he had been screaming over and over when they had all rushed out of the house to find David gone and Hilly in hysterics. The following day, Hilly had slept for 14 hours. He seemed even more confused in his mind during the time he spent in the soupy waking state. When the child psychologist detailed to his case asked his middle name, he responded Jonathan. It was David's middle name. Now he was sleeping, for all practical purposes, around the clock. Sometimes he opened his eyes. Seemed seemed even to be looking at Ev or one of the nurses, but when they spoke, he would only smile his sweet hilly brown smile and drift off again. Slipping away, he lay like an enchanted boy in a fairy tale castle, only the IV bottle over his head and the occasional PA announcements from the hospital corridor spoiling the illusion. Harley, that's enough. Stop. Good Lord. No. Harley, no. That's enough. Yeah, I hear you that somebody's here, but you don't need to. There ain't nobody here for her to bark at. There had been a great deal of excitement on the neurological front. No! Harley! That is enough! Stop! Harley, stop! Harley! Stop! Ain't nobody here. Ain't nobody outside. Ain't nobody in the driveway. Now stop. If you're barking at a cat, maybe the cat will smack you in the head. Oi. There had been a great deal of excitement on the neurological front at first. A dark, nonspecific shadow in the area of Hilly's cerebral cortex had suggested that the boy's strong dopiness might have been caused by a brain tumor. But when they got Hilly down to X-ray again 2 days later, his plates had been slow-tracked, the X-ray technician explained to Ev, because no one expects to find a brain tumor in the head of a 10-year-old, and there had been no previous symptoms to suggest one. The shadow had been gone. The neurologist had conferred with the X-ray technician, and Ev guessed from the technician's defensiveness that feathers must have flown. The neurologist told him that one more set of plates would be taken, but he believed they would show negative. The first set, he said, must have been defective. I suspected something must have been wacky, he told Ev. Why was that? The neurologist, a big man with a fierce red beard, smiled. Because that shadow was huge. To be perfectly blunt, a kid with a brain tumor that big would have been an extremely sick child for an extremely long time, if he was still alive at all. See? And then you still don't know what's wrong with Hilly? We're working on 2 or 3 lines of inquiry, the neurologist said. But his smile grew vague. His eyes shifted away from Ev's, and the next day the child psychologist showed up again. The child psychologist was a very fat woman with very dark black hair. She wanted to know where Hilly's parents were. Trying to find their other son, Ev expected. That would squash her. It didn't. Call them up and tell them I'd like some help finding this one. They came, but were no help. It changed. They were strange. The child psychologist felt it too, and after her initial run of questions, she started to pull away from them. Ev could actually feel her doing it. Ev himself had to work hard to keep from getting up and leaving the room. He didn't want to feel their strange eyes resting on him. Their gaze made him feel as if he had been marked for something. The woman in the plaid blouse and the faded jeans had been his daughter. She still looked like his daughter. She wasn't. Not anymore. Most of Marie was dead, and what was left, dying rapidly. The child psychologist didn't ask for them again. She had been in to examine Hilly twice since then. The second occasion had been Saturday afternoon, the day before the Haven Town Hall blew up. What were they feeding him? She asked abruptly. Ev had been sitting at the window, the hot sun falling on him, almost dozing. The fat woman's question startled him awake. What? What were they feeding him? Why, just regular food, he said. I doubt that. You needn't, he said. I took enough meals with him to know. Why do you ask? Because 10 of his teeth are gone, said curtly. Ev clenched a fist tightly in spite of the dull throb of arthritis and brought it down on one leg hard. What are you going to do, old man? David's gone, and it would be easier if you could convince yourself he was really dead, wouldn't it? Yes, that would make things simpler. Sadder but simpler. But he couldn't believe that. Part of him was still convinced that David was alive. Perhaps it was only wishful thinking, but somehow Ev didn't think so. He had done plenty of that in his time. Excuse me. And this didn't feel like that. This was a strong, pulsing intuition in his mind. David is alive. He is lost, and he is in danger of dying. Oh, most certainly. But he can still be saved. If you can make it up your mind to do something. And if you want to make up your mind... Excuse me. And if what you make up your mind to do is the right thing. Long odds for an old fart like you, who pisses a dark spot on his pants every once in a while. These days, when he can't get up to the John in time. Long odds. Late Monday evening, he had awakened from a dozing sleep, trembling in Hilly's hospital room. The nurse's office often turned a leniently blind eye to him and allowed him to stay, far past regular visiting hours. He had had a dreadful nightmare. He had dreamed he was in some dark and stony place. Needle-tipped mountains, sod like black sky strewn with the cold stars, and a wind as sharp as an ice pick whined in narrow, rocky piles. Below him, by starlight, he could see a huge, flat plain. It looked dry and cold and lifeless. Great cracks zigzagged across it, giving it the look of a crazy paving. From somewhere, he could hear David's thin voice. Okay, this is going to be the last section. I got it. I'm not going to stop. I can't continue reading while I'm coughing. He could hear David's voice. Help me, Grandpa. It hurts to breathe. Help me, Grandpa. It hurts to breathe. Help me. I'm scared. I don't want to do the trick, but Hilly made me, and now I can't find my way home. He sat looking at Hilly, his body bathed in sweat. It ran down his face like tears. He got up, went over to Hilly, and bent close to him. Hilly, he said, not for the first time. Where's your brother? Where's David? Only this time Hilly's eyes opened. His watery, unseeing stare chilled Everett. It was the stare of a blind Sybil. Altair 4, Hilly said calmly, and with perfect clarity. David is on Altair 4, and there's Tommyknockers. Tommyknockers, knocking at the door. His eyes slid shut, and he slept deeply again. Ev stood over him, perfectly motionless, his skin the color of putty. After a while, he began to shudder. Fortunately, that's where we're going to stop. I'd go on if I wasn't coughing so bad. But I'm going to go ahead and clear myself for a little bit. I should be back around 7, 8 o'clock. I'll have to see what time dinner gets done. But I'll be back tonight to read some more. Okay? We got at least an hour in. So you guys have a good day. Remember, I love you. And I will see you soon. Follow if you haven't. That way you can keep up. All right. Bye.